Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and you are welcome to the very first session of Principles of Microeconomics for this week. Um, I want to believe that everybody is on the same page. So we are going to conclude our discussion of production and trade this week, so that by next week we would move on. We're expected to start our discussion of demand and supply as a concept of microeconomics. So we are expected to cover four important subsections under the broad theme of production and trade. And last week, we looked at production possibility frontier. And during the course of that class, we examined the importance of choice. We looked at the rationale for economic choices, and we did argue that the scarcity of resources is the number one reasons why economic agents make choices. Number two is the fact that our needs are unsatiable. So in other words, man is wired to always demand for more. And when you demand for more relative to the available resources, then you do not have a choice but to develop what we call scale of preference. So when you have your scale of preference, then you can now begin to choose which one should I prioritize, which one should I let go. And of course, when you make a choice at that point in time, all other items not selected becomes your opportunity cost, which is the alternative forgone. We also mentioned that there are different types of resources: natural resources, human resources, capital resources, and entrepreneurial resources. One important thing I mentioned at this point last week was the fact that these are also known as the factors of production. The only thing which we have done differently, given the fact that this is not a freshman's class, is to now broaden it up so that in each category of the factor of production, you can see the various examples that exist there. We also looked at ownership of resources, and here we explained the importance of control and legal rights. We also mentioned that we've seen cases where people control resources but do not have the legal right to claim ownership of such resources. So it is better to have control and to also have the legal rights over such or any given resources before you can claim ownership of such resources. So we moved on to the concept of possibility frontier, production possibility frontier. Here, recall that we also mentioned that production possibility frontier is the same as production possibility curve. It is also known as the production possibility boundary. This actually helps us to identify visually the maximum combination of two resources that are available to us in any given economy with a view to achieving the goals and objectives of the economy. This has three important layers, which we are all expected to pay attention to. The first layer is right inside of the production possibility frontier, which, as you can see on the screen, is labeled point X. The second layer are those points sitting directly on the production possibility frontier. And the third layer is that point outside of the production possibility frontier. Oftentimes, it is said that that point outside of the production possibility frontier is an impossible space, an area that cannot be attained. But advances in knowledge has made us to understand that point Y is simply the direct opposite of point X. While point X, sitting inside of the production possibility boundary, speaks to inefficient use of resources, underutilization of resources. Point Y, outside of the production possibility frontier, symbolizes growth. In other words, you've been able to leverage the uniqueness of capital, okay? The uniqueness of technology or whatever other resources that is available to you in order to push the production possibility frontier outward. And this is what we refer to as growth. So we identified the various issues which I've just mentioned on the utilization of resources, efficiency in production, as well as growth. So these are the three main issues associated with production possibility frontier. And we also gave this analogy where we are expected to have a deeper understanding of a complete shift in production possibility frontier and partial shifts in production possibility frontier. So to the left from my own side, and that'll probably be to the right from your side, okay, is a case of complete shift in the production possibility frontier, while the other symbolizes a partial shift in the production possibility frontier. So that was where we concluded last week. And today we are moving on to comparative advantage, specialization, and gains from trade. Now, these are all important concepts that are embedded in the study of trade. So if you must understand trade, or if there's anyone on this call today who is willing to pursue career in international economics, career in international trade, or you want to combine trade and fiscal policy, trade and monetary policy, then you need to pay attention to this concept. So as a way of starting the class, we are going to be looking at some fundamental concepts. The first concept is trade itself. And During the course of the class, we're going to ask ourselves, what is trade? We're also going to ask, what are the various dimensions of trade? So when we do justice to these questions, we move on to the next one, which is gains from trade. You actually make gains when you embark on international trade. However, what are the conditions? Okay, what are the conditions that facilitate gains from trade? And that's why we're going to examine the predictors of gains from trade and these are the respective sources that drive gains from trade. So when we're done with all of this, then we move on to the next concept, which is terms of trade. And finally, we would round off this discussion with trade barriers. Interestingly, for the purpose of this session, dear participants, what I have done is to ensure that I prepare my slides up to the terms of trade. Trade barriers will be an assignment for every one of us. So what is trade? What is trade? Trade simply refers to the exchange of goods, services, and resources between two or more parties, often involving buying and selling. This definition, this definition has four important elements that I wish everyone on the call will pay attention to. The first is the fact that it engages in acts of exchange. In other words, you are going to give out something in order to collect something back in return. Earlier in history, we understand that we used to engage in trade by barter, in which we exchange object for objects. If I need yam, but I have sweet potato, I have to bring it to the marketplace where I will give her the potato and in return, I will get my tuber of yam. This is no longer in vogue because advances in knowledge has made us to better understand the symbolic importance of trade. And what is the symbolic importance of trade? Trade is not just only the exchange of goods and services. It has practically become a way of life. It has practically become a platform for international relationships. It has practically become a platform for engagement within a given regional boundary. And of course, trade has also become a means to earning a living. So when you engage in trade, This means is that you're going to have access to resources, a title which you never had. It also means that you are going to be interacting with other economic agents, be it individuals, businesses, or government agencies within that given locality. What it simply means also is that when you engage in trade, especially between two or more countries, then you are eminently qualified to be referred to as an international enterprise or international agent because you will be transversing between the boundaries of two or more countries. So, this brings us to the question of what are the various dimensions of trade. Trade can be domestic, international, regional, and interregional. As a way of analogy, dear participants, when you engage in trade anywhere in Nigeria, then it is often referred to as domestic trade. You're moving goods from Lagos to Ibadan to Oyo, Oyo to Ile-Ife, Ile-Ife to Akure, etc. You are simply engaging in domestic trade as long as such trading activities evolve around people of the same background, people of the same nationality, people of the same origin, etc. However, when you now transact business across the border, that is, you are now carrying goods across the Nigerian borders into Benin Republic with a view to buying and selling, it is known as international trade. Regional trade is another important dimension as well as interregional. Both of them recognizes that there are regions or nations can be pulled together in regions. Take, for example, in Nigeria, we have 6 regions: South South, Southwest, Southeast. Then for the North, we have the North Central, Northwest, Northeast. That gives us the 6 geopolitical zones in Nigeria. So if you trade from one region to the other, are you saying you're practicing regional trade? Of course, yes. But on a broader note, when we say regional trade, we are looking at trade between regions, either in Africa or other parts of the world. So we are currently situated, Nigeria is currently situated in West Africa. West Africa is a regional body in its own right. So when you move your country, you export from Nigeria to any other country in West Africa, you are simply embarking on regional trade. What about interregional? Interregional simply means you are trading between regions, two or more regions. Take, for example, trading between West Africa region and East Africa region, or those we call SADC, looking at the southern parts of Africa. So, dear participants, all of these constitute trade, but in different forms. Hence, the dimensions of trade. When you embark on trading, whether it is domestic, whether it is international, regional, or interregional, you are expected to leverage the natural or acquired advantage that is at your disposal. And when you do this, it enriches your dimensions of trade, which eventually leads to higher living standards. But before fulfilling that very chain, we have been made to understand in economics, building on the fundamental theories of international trade, that when you leverage your natural or acquired advantage, it actually promotes specialization. And what does specialization does for us? Specialization helps us to understand the opportunity costs of production, thereby helping us to be able to manage resources at our disposal in order to earn a good living. Some of these predictors or advantage, as the case may be, include climate. You may actually be sitting in a favorable climate where the climate of a particular region may actually favor the production of a particular good far ahead of any potential customers. The second driver is resource endowment. Dear participants, if you open your palm and look through your palm, you realize that indeed there are 5 fingers. But in terms of height, are all these fingers of the same height? Are all the fingers of the same height? It is obvious. The answer is no. And that is why in Nigeria, one of the prominent idioms is that all fingers are not equal. In a similar manner, resources available to every country vary because no two countries are equally understood. I mean, no two countries are equally endowed. Take, for example, Nigeria. Nigeria is the bride of the entire country today, not because we have a superb GDP figure, no, but right now, Nigeria is richly endowed with human resources. Nigeria may be referred to as the poverty capital of the world. Oh, yes. But at the same time, Nigeria is also home to the largest population of young people. That's also a plus, and it is a resource in its own right. Production, production, while some can produce production because the production cost is high. Specializations include international competition, technology. When you have access to all these things, it can actually inspire specialization, and that would lead to greater trade. Now, there are two other important concepts that we need to pay attention to. Absolute advantage, which does not subscribe to specialization anyway, and comparative advantage. While absolute advantage speak less of specialization, comparative advantage speaks more to the subject of specialization. In other words, it assumes that no two countries can live in isolation. You can produce what I can produce. In a similar manner, I can also produce some of the things you can produce. So in order to achieve gains from trade, it was David Ricardo who was able to identify the utility of opportunity costs and subsequently popularized the concept of comparative advantage in trade. So what is absolute advantage of an individual, a firm, or a country than any other entity to be? In other words, we can say that Nigeria is self-sufficient, which we refer to as autarky in economics. Autarky in economics. So, with this in mind, we do not need the concept of opportunity cost because both countries have what it takes to produce the commodities that is desirable to them. Please look at the table that I have posted. There are two countries, country A and B, and both countries produce wheat and car. Country A produces 10 units of wheat and 5 units of car within the specified month. Country B, on the other hand, produces 15 tons of wheat, while country B was able to only enjoy. Country B, on the other part, was able to produce 3 units of cars. So what do you notice from here? Given the available resources, country A does better with the production of cars, while country B does better with the production of wheat. Hence, in absolute terms, it will be advisable that country A leaves the production of wheat and focuses on the production of cars, while country B is advised to focus all its energy and resources on the production of wheat and leave car production for country A. This is what we refer to as absolute advantage. So, country B can produce 15 tons of wheat, while country A is always only produce 10. I've explained all of this. So what's the implication of absolute advantage for trade? What this simply means, just as I've summarized, is that country A should specialize in car production, while country B should specialize in the production of wheat. One more thing is that by trading cars for wheat, both country A and country B can enjoy more of both goods and services than they could have produced individually. Comparative advantage. Dear participants, may I put this on the table that absolute advantage was the norm during the classical era. So, with advances in knowledge, David Ricardo was also able to debunk the absolute advantage theorem, and he was able to postulate the comparative advantage theorem in trade. He described comparative advantage as situation that arises when a country focuses on producing goods for which they have the lowest opportunity cost. Please note this importance. Unlike absolute advantage, comparative advantage places premium on the differences in the opportunity cost. It places differences on the opportunity cost. So, how do we go about computing the opportunity costs? Remember, opportunity cost simply means the alternative forgone. So, if the available resources at the disposal of these firms or these two countries are the same, just as you can see, country A uses the same resources to produce 10 tons of wheat and 5 units of cars. Country B uses the same resources to produce 15 tons of wheat and 3 units of cars in 1 month. So the big question is, what is the opportunity cost of one car? What is the opportunity cost of one car? In other words, what do we sacrifice? What is the unit of wheat that must be sacrificed in order to be able to produce more of the other units? Pay attention to the fraction. Just as you can see here, we are looking for the opportunity cost of one car with respect to the tons of wheat. In that case, the value for wheat becomes the numerator, the value for cars becomes the denominator. For the opportunity cost of 1 tons of wheat with respect to cars, what do you notice? The value for car becomes the numerator, while the value for wheat becomes the denominator. So when you do that, what do we see? The opportunity cost of 1 unit of car for tons of wheat is 2, while for country B is 5. What does that tell us? Country A enjoys the lower opportunity costs. Now, when we move on to the opportunity cost of 1 ton, you realize that country A has an opportunity cost of 0.5 and country B has an opportunity cost of 0.2. You can see that each of the countries enjoys has that power, and it enjoys a lower opportunity cost in its own right. Country A enjoys a lower opportunity cost of 1 car with respect to tons of wheat, while country B has a lower opportunity cost of tons of wheat with respect to cars. So when you see this, what kind of decisions are you expected to make? In other words, each country will have to focus on the production of goods for which they enjoy that lower opportunity cost. So just as you can see, country A has a comparative advantage in car production because it will give up less wheat for every unit of cars. Don't forget, when we say opportunity cost, is the alternative that you have to forego. So what it means is that for every unit of cars to be produced, country A will give up 2 tons of 2 tons of wheat, while for every unit of car to be produced, country B is expected to give up 5 tons of wheat. So, since country A enjoys that lower opportunity cost, country A has a comparative advantage in car production. Look at the other side to the opportunity cost of 1 ton of wheat. In a layman's language, what that means is that for every ton of wheat that we are expected to produce, how many units of cars should we give up? How many units of cars should we give up? So, in this case, country A will have to give up 0.5 units of cars in order to produce 1 ton of wheat. On the other hand, country B will have to give up 0.2 units of cars in order to produce 1 ton of wheat. So when you compare, what do you notice? Country B enjoys a lower opportunity cost. Hence, country B is said to have a comparative advantage in the production of wheat relative to country A. So, based on this understanding, David Ricardo is of the view that we should leave the production of cars to country A, leave the production of wheat to country B, and let the two countries trade amongst themselves. So, when we do that, it has implications for trade. And what are these implications? One, country A specializes in producing cars because it has a lower opportunity cost in that regard. Country B will specialize in the production of wheat because it has a lower opportunity cost in this regard. Now, when they both engage in trade, what David Ricardo emphasizes is that there is a big likelihood that more cars will be produced, more wheat will be produced, and the value of trade between country A and B is most likely going to increase. That increase in the value of trade between country A and country B is what is referred to as the gains from trade. So, where does gains from trade comes from? The most important source of gains from trade is the opportunity cost of production, which in most cases differ between or amongst countries. It is also the slope of the production possibility frontier. Remember, when we discuss the production possibility frontier, you are combining resources, specifically two resources or, or any given resources to produce a combination of goods or service. So, The opportunity cost concept is actually from the production possibility frontier that we looked at last week. The opportunity cost as a driver of gains from trade is also important because it helps us to identify the unit of a good that is given up in order to produce one more unit of the other commodity. Hence, international differences in opportunity cost of production drives gains from trade. The big question now, in order for us to understand better, is how does this international differences propel opportunity costs and which eventually leads to gains from trade? One, the country with the lower opportunity cost has a comparative advantage, just as we saw in the case of country A and country B. Two, opportunity cost is a function of relative cost and not absolute cost. So, in the theory of comparative advantage in trade focuses more on relativity rather than absolutism. So, we look at it, the unit of this relative to that, the unit of that relative to this. The ratio, the proportion gives us the opportunity cost, and it is on the basis of that opportunity cost derived that we make the decisions. There is no comparative advantage when two countries have equal opportunities. So what this is simply telling us is that it is also possible that when you calculate the opportunity cost, there could be scenarios where these countries would have the same opportunity cost. And what happens when when you have such? Should two countries producing similar products have different opportunity costs? Production can be increased via reallocation of resources within each country. So remember, we also talked about resources under the theory, our production possibility frontier or production possibility curve. And that for you to push out that production possibility frontier, you either reallocate your resources or you embrace an appropriate technology that can help you instill efficiency into the combination of the resources that you have or that will help you reallocate resources. So when you have all of these four items at the back of our mind, then we are speaking to the concept of gains from trade. Before I stop my presentation so that I will give room for question and answer, it is also important that we look at terms of trade. Unfortunately, we undermine the economic significance of terms of trade. Yes, there is no gain saying that Nigeria is a trading nation. We engage in a lot of trading activities. But the big question is that, is our terms of trade as a country favorable or unfavorable? Oftentimes, we trivialize terms of trade and pay more attention to our balance of trade. forgetting that the foundation is actually the terms of trade. I'm going to share a one-pager with you after this class. I want you to read it and digest it. And maybe you can share your thoughts with me. Did the author made reference to terms of trade at all? Because the government official whom the author reported also ignored the symbolic importance of terms of trade. So, what is terms of trade, dear participants? Terms of trade is simply the quantity of imported goods that can be obtained per unit of exported goods. Sometimes when I teach these subjects, I always like to break it down. What does this big grammar means? The quantity of imported goods that can be obtained per unit of goods exported. What does this mean? It simply refers to the fact that for every unit of commodity that you export, you must ask yourself, what is the quantity of goods that I should import? So, what this is telling us as young students, as young undergraduates studying economics that love his or her country, is that your country cannot thrive by just importing only, by importing only. You must make effort to export. And when you are exporting, we must pay attention to this index. The index of our export prices as a ratio of our index of the ratio, as a ratio of the index of import prices. Unfortunately, we are a small country. From the perspective of global trading, we are a small country. Nigeria is a giant of Africa, no doubt about that. Nigeria has the largest economy in Africa, no doubt about that, even though the reality shows that we have slided even down to number 4, right behind Egypt, South Africa, and Algeria. So, because we pay lip service to our terms of trade, what are we producing? What are we manufacturing? What value addition have we prioritized which can be sold to the outside world? So if I look at it from a layman's point of view, what this is simply telling us is that if you are not exporting, you should not even think of importing, because you can only import after you have exported one or two items. But because we have debunked the autarky philosophy and appreciating the fact that no country can be self-sufficient. Hence, no country can actually live a closed economy. So in a similar manner, Nigeria cannot be a closed economy. So yes, we have the right to export. We have the right to import. So, but what this is also telling us again is that once your import is increasing at an alarming rate far beyond your exports, then there is a red signal. Technically, that tells us that our terms of trade can either increase or reduce. So when the terms of trade reduces, what does it mean? It simply refers to scenarios where the rise, when the price of our imported goods are rising, ceteris paribus. In other words, the prices of our imports are increasing while the prices of our exports are constant. This is the case with Nigeria because we do not have the power to even control the price in the first place. We don't have the power to control the price. And that's why we refer to as a small economy at the global market level. Terms of trade can also be improved when the price of your exported goods is increasing, ceteris paribus, that is holding every other factors constant. But technically, we refer to this as either a favorable terms of trade or an unfavorable terms of trade. So when the terms of trade is favorable, what does it mean? It means that it has a favorable change. More can be imported per unit of goods exported than previously. And it is unfavorable when there is an unfavorable change. That is, less can be imported for any given unit of goods exported in than in the previous time. Now, we also have the balance of trade, but that is not a part of this topic. It's something we're going to look at under macroeconomics. Under macroeconomics. So our attention is expected to be limited to terms of trade. Beyond the terms of trade, we are also expected to understand that, yes, there could be barriers to trade. There could be barriers to trade. These are simply obstructions mounted intentionally or unintentionally with a view to obstructing the flow of trade between two or more countries. So barriers to trade can be economic in nature. It can also be non-economic. When it is economic, it means that you are using economic tools to obstruct trade, especially fiscal policy tools, tariffs, taxation, duties, etc. You impose tariffs and duties, import duties or export duties on a nation so that cost of bringing in commodities will be high. And if it is export duty, in other words, you don't want people to export, so you slam export duties on them just to discourage exportation. A very common non-economic trade barrier is ban, outright ban, and that is using the political tool available at the disposal of a leader. All right, dear participants, now you have the floor to make suggestions, provide comments, and ask questions. I sincerely thank you for cooperating and ensuring that your mic was muted all through. So you have the floor now for comments. Are there areas that you want further clarifications? Are there areas that you think you still do not understand and you want further explanations? So with this, I'm convinced that we can have one or two, we can have a short assessment before we go for the Christmas break this year. Before we go for Christmas break. We are done. Next week, we will take on another topic, and from there, we can have uh, a short assessment, multiple question of maybe 5 or 10 questions. I don't want it to be too much where we finish the entire class before we start talking of assessments. No, it's continuous. So let's take it step by step, step by step, one bite at a time. Is that okay? All right, dear participants. I'm looking through the chat box. Okay, no questions, no comments. All right. So with this, I am confident that to a large extent, the concept of production possibility frontier, the concept of trade, as well as the use of comparative advantage, absolute advantage, and specialization in trade is well understood, and that students, our participants can actually explain that. All right, Antonia, you have your hands up. Could you please unmute yourself and speak to every one of us?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Antonia.
Thank you so much for the class. It has been very enlightening. I just want to confirm. For the assumptions of absolute advantage and comparative advantage, is it assumed that there are only two products that each country is producing?
Yes, for your level, yes. Only two.
All right, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. As we advanced, in economics, we also have advanced trade theories. So for advanced trade theories, we have cases where we can also look at three or more commodities. But for those theories now, we will be using advanced methodologies, okay? Not the basic theory of Adam Smith or uh, David Ricardo. For those two theories, they only assume that two products are available and that each country should specialize in the production of one depending on their comparative advantage and that could actually lead to gains in trade. All right. Thank you very much for that question. Justina,
Afternoon, sir.
okay?
Yes, I want to confirm about outright ban we should talk about. Can it also be regulated, or because it's a political tool use, can it later be considered as a tool that can also be relegated by by the government, or it's just a ban that cannot be looked into?
All right. When I say outright ban, is just only one out of the several political tools. It can also be regulated. And if you look at, let me give you a very good example. Let me give you a very good example. The latest on board is Trump 2.0. Okay, I was watching the news yesterday, and Taiwan seems to lean more to the US than Chinese. So apparently, if you watch the era, the first 4 years of President Trump, he was always against China. And his argument is that China becoming the manufacturer of the world is practically taking away jobs from the Americans. Hence, there was a need to cut trading activities with China. So if you want to produce, bring back your factory to the US. So the same thing now, the fear now is currently gripping people in Taiwan because Taiwan is number one in the production of chips. And the question now is, will there be an executive bill that will regulate or ban? So they are of the view that they are simply not exporting or importing US jobs, but instead they are simply serving as the manufacturer, okay, where the chips are being produced, and the American market is actually prioritized. So when you look at the non-economic barriers, okay, but outright ban is one. There can also be regulation. The other example that I'm also going to give, you can check them up online, is about 2 days ago or so, the president of Canada actually had to go and meet with President Trump, okay, in the US, even when he has not been sworn in. And when the pressman asked him why, he said he knows that one of Trump's policy would be to hinder trade between the US and Canada, considering the fact that Canada seems to be enjoying more of a favorable terms of trade ahead of the US. I'm going to drop that article, one article. I want you to read it and digest it. So, and in sync with Trump's agenda of making America great again, there is going to be a need to reverse America's unfavorable terms of trade. And that may have negative impact on Canada's terms of trade as well. So in order to wait, in order to, how do I call it? The Canadian president argued that when Trump speaks, it is not an empty threat. So he wouldn't wait until he assumes office and signs executive bills that will affect the terms of trade of Canada before he starts acting. So he would rather act now and discuss things with the President of America to be and let us know areas of disagreement so that they can both work collaboratively to make or to achieve favorable terms of trade for both countries. Okay, so interestingly, they speak economics a lot, but here in this part of the world, we speak politics a lot. And but I'm hopeful that with your crop of generation and understanding some of these economic terms and concepts, you would be able to speak confidently out there tomorrow to policy makers and let them know that one of the bane of our foreign exchange management in the country today is our inability to manage our terms of trade. Once we are able to do that very well, the pressure on the naira will reduce because we're going to see less demand for the dollar and there will be an increase in the demand for naira as well as the supply of the naira. Okay, Antonia, your hand is up again.
Yes, sir. So I have just one more question. Um, you said
Please go
that
ahead.
absolute advantage speaks less of specialization, while comparative advantage speaks more of specialization. Please, can you shed more light on that?
Yes, absolute advantage only focuses on your ability to produce efficiently. Is that okay? It's your ability to produce efficiently. So when you produce more, you enjoy absolute advantage automatically. But for comparative advantage, comparative advantage theory believes that the mere fact that you are producing more right now does not mean that you have that comparative advantage. So the only means of identifying that country which enjoys comparative advantage is to use that concept of opportunity costs. So when you now use the opportunity cost concept, you can now see vividly that, oh, this country has a lower opportunity cost relative to the other country in the production of this commodity. On the other hand, this country has a lower opportunity cost relative to the other country. So what David Ricardo is now saying is that we must ensure that there's gains in trade. So not just only one country so pretending over all activities in the international markets. Oh, is that okay? So rather than saying that country A alone will be producing both commodities. Remember that the underlying assumption is that there will be only two commodities. So rather than allowing country A alone to be producing the two commodities, which will now be imported by the other country, David Ricardo appreciates the fact that every country has an endowment. Hence, when you use the concept of opportunity cost, you can see systematically where one country can do better than the other, or where one country can do less better than the other. So where you do better than the other, focus on that and let the other country focus on the other one so that production can increase and you can both exchange the excesses. And once you're exchanging the excesses in form of international trade, then it gives birth to gains of trade. And one of such gains is competition. So international competition. So improved technological know-how, you know, improved productivity, because you also want to catch up with demand. So once you engage in trade, obviously there are gains that comes to you. Unfortunately, it is always important that we mention it because of exposure and learning purposes. Unfortunately, for us in Nigeria, when we talk about trade, our emphasis is always on foreign exchange earnings. As a matter of fact, when you read through the fundamental theories of trade, the least gain you benefit from trade is foreign exchange earnings. Foreign exchange earnings will come, but don't let that be the focal point. Why are you trading? So that we can earn dollars, we can earn dollars, we can earn dollars. No, there are better reasons why we should engage in trade than just foreign exchange earnings. And that's where we are still getting it wrong as a nation. So sadly, we have been running an unfavorable terms of trade for decades. And I'm simply looking forward to that day. Perhaps if it will happen in my lifetime, or maybe when we are all gone, we will have a set of Nigerians, young Nigerians, that will shape things and ensure that we begin to enjoy a favorable terms of trade in this country. During the second semester for the economic students who are here, we're going to look at another critical theory, which we call mercantilism. Mercantilism is another theory that looks at that subject of trade, and that trade is actually a source of wealth creation in any country. Any country desirable of enjoying prosperity should invest in trade, not just buying and selling. No, that's not the definition of trade. Their own definition of trade is you produce and export the excesses. Anything that your country needs, you must strive to produce it and export the remaining. And the argument is that when you take trade serious, it has a multiplier effect. Industrialization,
Until 9 times I finished.
technology advancement, as well as knowledge enrichment because trade itself requires sophisticated knowledge, sophisticated know-how. So when we look at this during the second semester, you will enjoy it better. Trade is an important subject. And when you go to countries like China, Taiwan, in their universities, many of the universities have departments of international trade, not just economics, departments of what? International trade, where the ABC of trade policies, trade design, etc., are being studied. And that is why China today is at the forefront of international trade all over the world, while many countries here in Africa are struggling to catch up with even what to sell. So, value creation is the key word today, not foreign exchange earnings. Value creation. So, we need to drift away from it. Thank you very much for that question. Any other
Thank you.
one before we
Yes,
round
sir.
up?
I have a question, sir.
All right. All right, Rashid.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You mentioned Nigeria cannot influence prices at the global level. So I wanted to know, like, what would have been the positive effect on Nigeria economy if Nigeria could be able to influence prices at the global level markets?
Now, when you say influencing prices, what we're saying here is that most of our exports, we don't determine the price. Most of our exports, we do not determine the price because of one important reason. We export more of crude resources, and there are established agencies in the international markets that determines that price. Just imagine on top of your head, you being a novice driver, that you just bought one korope and you put it on the road. If you have ever plied Mushin or you plied Oshodi very well after 4 p.m., who determines the transport fare? Who determines the transport fare? If you understand my analogy, it is
I think the
not the
working
bus
class.
driver who
The
determines the
working class.
transport fare. What do you say?
I guess the working class.
It is not the
The working
working
class.
class. It just it is those
The
boys on
drivers.
the road that we call Agbiru. The boys we call the Agbirus are the ones who determine what the price will be, especially after 4 p.m., knowing fully well that the demand for transportation services will far outweigh the supply. So they will tell them, take it Oshodi to Mongoro is 500 naira. And they know that for every trip, you drop 500 naira. So they also want their returns to increase in folds. So that same scenario is what plays out at the international market, where oftentimes you export commodities, but you are not the one determining the price of that commodity. And that is where we have a huge challenge in terms of what our import would be vis-a-vis our exports. So we concentrate so much on exporting raw materials because our primary objective is foreign exchange earnings. But now is the time for us to now, focus on value creation. If you have cocoa, rather than exporting the cocoa, can we create industries here that will add value to it? Backward integration, set up the factory, convert it to edibles that can now be well packaged and we send to countries based on request. Not we just pushing everything to the international market. Is that okay? The same thing with crude. We can actually refine our crude here, and I'm actually looking forward to the next 1 year or two so that we can evaluate what has changed and what has not changed following the successful opening of the Dangote refinery. Okay? It calls for an important evaluation if that can be done, really, so that we can be able to now justify whether it makes sense for us to have our refineries or not. Trade is actually sweet. Not in raw materials, not in raw materials, coffee of the colonial masters. But unfortunately for us, that the raw materials that they is in their own country. And of course, because they were out as the marketplace, so whatever is being produced is dumped into our own market here. That was the genesis of our own love for consumption only. And we are still living in that dark days of consumption, import, 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 and export only raw materials. We need to depart away from that because it simply means an unfavorable terms of trade for us. And an unfavorable terms of trade actually diminishes the gains from trade. It diminishes the gains from trade. All right. So what this means, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, is that if we're going to move away from export of raw materials, it means that we need to start producing locally. And what do you produce? You do not just produce for producing sake. You need to produce what your people or what the citizens are willing to consume, that which will be demanded for. So it now makes sense for us to discuss demand and supply. And by God's grace, next week, that's exactly what we're going to look at. What constitutes demand? What are the various types of demand? What constitutes supply? What are the various types of supply? The determinants of supply, the determinants of demand, and we will take it forth into the concept of elasticity of demand supply. Hopefully, we should be able to finish all of these be over the next 2 weeks. So what it means, dear participants, is that if we're able to do that over the next 2 weeks, God willing, between that week, the week of 16th, or let me just say that the week of, we may have a short assessment test on the 23rd of this month, just before we go for, I don't know when the university will close down for Christmas break. However, but if we're still going to be having lectures on the 23rd, 24th, okay, then it means that we would have a short test on the 23rd. And if not, it could be a welcome pack for us when we resume back in January as a welcome package. You've done this before you went for the break. Now that you are back, let's do this first before we now continue the remaining part of the semester. Is that okay? So I'll figure it out, whichever one works for us. We would play by the rules. Is that okay?
No problem,
All right. Thank you very much. I sincerely appreciate every one of you and for the sacrifice and for the fellowship which our students of procurement has extended to all other students from Faculty of Social Sciences, because this time is actually meant for students of procurement, and they have willingly accepted every other students of social sciences to join them because they had a clash this morning for their own period for those going for accounting and co. And I'm also aware that the students of uh, the students of education, students from education, some of them actually are having a class at this point in time. I sincerely apologize for that, but just as I promised, the recordings of the session will be made available for them, for every one of you. So we will just accommodate ourselves. You know, the online session is quite interesting, but it has its own challenges, and we will try our best possible to manage every situation without leaving anyone behind. Thank you so much, and please enjoy the rest of the day. I appreciate you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
You're most welcome.